TENET was first released in 2020, at the height of the coronavirus, when the last thing anybody wanted to do was sit in a crowded theatre full of coughing strangers for 2.5 hours. And those who did risk it found it rather hard to understand what the hell was going on. But now it's on Prime Video, so everyone can watch it safely. I've watched it twice. The first time I saw it, I was a bit lost. But the second time I put the subtitles on, took notes, so now I think I've just about managed to figure it out. So the first problem we have is the protagonist. He's the movie's main character, yet we learn virtually nothing about him. Not even his name. All we learn is that he's a really good CIA agent, and he's really good at killing people. That's it. But I think this is intentional. Before Daniel Craig took over the role, this was basically all you knew about James Bond, although he didn't work for the CIA, he worked for MI6. And this is very much a Bond movie with added time travel, which is probably how Christopher Nolan pitched it in the first place. So let's follow his journey through the movie. He starts in an opera house in Kiev. So obviously this was filmed before the whole war started. There's a terrorist siege going on. The protagonist goes in disguised as a cop to extract a fellow CIA agent. It does not go well, as they both get captured by the terrorists, and he resorts to eating a cyanide capsule to avoid being interrogated. Personally, I'd have spilled my guts, but I'm not a spy. Anyway, he wakes up in hospital, and he's not dead. It turns out the whole thing was a ruse. Whether that's the entire siege of the Opera House or just the final bit, it's not very clear. Anyway, he chose to die rather than give up his secrets, so he passes. And as a reward, he gets to be part of TENET. This is an organisation fighting a temporal Cold War against mysterious unknown forces from the future. Yes, it's all very vague. Firstly, they send him off to live in a wind turbine for an unspecified amount of time. It could be days, weeks, years even. But then he's sent off to meet a scientist. She's played by Clemens Posey, who definitely deserves more than one scene. Anyway, she briefs him on inverted bullets, which travel backwards in time from when you fire them. And he unfires several bullets which have presumably been stuck in the wall for several centuries. Anyway, next he travels to Mumbai. It's not immediately clear why he does this, but you do find out eventually. But first he meets Robert Pattinson, who plays Neil, who is the protagonist's partner for the entire movie. And it turns out he knows a lot more than the protagonist. It would have been a really good twist if he turned out to be the bad guy all along, but he doesn't. Anyway, they track down the manufacturer of the inverted bullets by catapulting themselves up a skyscraper in a kind of reverse bungee jump, which I'm pretty sure is physically impossible in real life. Anyway, the arms dealer turns out to be a woman called Priya, who is also part of TENET, and she explains who the real bad guy is. This is Andrea Sator, who has a wife called Kat, and a son called Max, who isn't really important. Now, if you saw the BBC miniseries The Night Manager a few years ago, you may remember Elizabeth Debicki, playing the bored wife of a billionaire arms dealer, who was played by Hugh Laurie. Well, she's basically playing the exact same character here, except this time her husband is played by another one of Emma Thompson's exes, Kenneth Branagh, with a rather dodgy Russian accent. Sator is blackmailing Kat to stay with him by holding a painting that she falsely claims as real. So Kat asks the protagonist to steal it for her before she will introduce him to Sator. The painting is stored in a free port in Oslo, so the protagonist and Neil crash a plane into it, as you do, in order to break in. They don't actually find the painting, but they do find a machine out of which comes two men in gas masks, who proceed to fight them both. The one fighting the protagonist appears to be moving backwards in time, firing inverted bullets and doing all sorts of weird stunts, before he disappears behind a wall. More on this later. Anyway, Priya explains that the machine is called a turnstile, and it's used to invert people and objects and send them backwards in time. Anyway, Kat introduces the protagonist to Sator, although it turns out he does still have the forged painting. Obviously Sato doesn't trust the protagonist and thinks he's just after his wife. It's unclear whether or not he is. But they go sailing and the protagonist saves Sato's life, which is good enough for him. This is all setting up another big heist scene, which is like something out of a Fast and Furious movie. Neil and the protagonist go to Thailand, which is apparently a real place, in order to steal some plutonium that's being transported through town, like all radioactive materials are apparently. So there's a big heist scene with lots of cars and fire trucks. The protagonist opens the package and finds it's not radioactive after all, which is lucky for him. It's actually a mysterious artefact that looks kind of like an old box camera. There was one of these at the Opera House earlier on as well. I should probably have mentioned it back then. Anyway, this is where it gets complicated. Sato inverts himself. And spends the rest of the movie going backwards in time. But the protagonist doesn't encounter him in a linear order. So it's easy to get confused. Basically anyone wearing a gas mask is travelling backwards in time. Anyway, he kidnaps his wife in order to persuade the protagonist to give him the artefact. But he only gives him an empty case. Then the protagonist goes to the turnstile and we see the inverted Sato shoot Kat, who is not inverted, with an inverted bullet, which means she's in big trouble. So the only way she can recover is if she becomes inverted herself. So Neil, the protagonist, Kat, all get in the turnstile and they're inverted for most of the rest of the movie. So they get in a shipping container and travel all the way back to Oslo because they knew there was a turnstile there a week ago. The protagonist finds himself in the same building, fighting his past self, and it turns out that he was both of the gas mask men from the earlier fight. Presumably the only reason he shoots at himself is because he knew the bullets wouldn't do any damage. So we learned the artefacts are actually 9 parts of an algorithm, and when they're put together, the world will end. And at this point Sato has all 9 artefacts. But on the plus side we learn that Tenet now has an army, which you would think might have been helpful earlier on. They realise that Sato's gone back to the same day as the Opera House siege, when there was a big explosion in Russia. And they figure he's going to use that explosion to detonate the artefact. Meanwhile, Kat figures out that Sato's gone back in time to his yacht in Vietnam, where he plans to kill himself, which will also end the world. And this is still the same day as the Opera House siege and the Russia explosion. Anyway, there's a big fight scene. Soldiers going backwards and forwards in time, buildings exploding and unexploding. To be honest, I was kind of flagging by this point. It's a very long movie, and I was kind of hoping it would have ended by now. But basically, in the end, the protagonist and Neil are captured by Sato's second in command, a big bald Russian guy, and he's about to set off the artefact. But they're saved by a mysterious gas-masked guy going backwards in time, and the artefact is saved. Meanwhile, on the yacht, Kat and Sato are both going forwards in time again. Kat kills Sato and goes off to live a happy life. Then Neil decides he's going backwards in time to help out in the fight again, and the protagonist realises that Neil's about to go to his death, but he will save everyone in doing so. So yeah, that's a lot, and even after 2 viewings there's quite a bit I'm not really sure about. I did enjoy it a lot more the second time around, so I think it's one of those movies that the more times you watch it, the more you'll get out of it. The action scenes are spectacular, and would doubtless have looked much better in the cinema, while all these science fiction ideas explored give it a lot more depth than most movies of this scale usually have. At the same time, you can't help feeling that a smaller scale movie or a TV show even might have been able to explore those ideas with a bit more depth, without trying to cram them into rushed conversations between big action scenes. And there's not much of an emotional story either. There is a bit of a connection between Kat and the protagonist, but it's never really developed far enough that you can call it a romance. And yes, if it had, it might have been a bit too conventional, a bit too much of a cliché, but still it would have been better than nothing. Still, I spent 5 hours watching this movie over the last few days, and I can honestly say it was time well spent. That's all from me. Please subscribe if you like this sort of thing, or press like if you just like this video, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.